The colonization of South Africa, Part 2. Unique features of the colonization. 3 unique features of the colonization will be discussed, namely the way in which South Africa was colonized, the new people group and language that developed because of colonization, and lastly, the new nation of South Africa. This video is made without the intention of entering into an argument as to whom South Africa belongs or the necessity of land restitution that is rife at this moment. The intention is to state the facts of the colonization of South Africa from a somehow different angle in order to understand the composition of this country better and to take cognition of the fact that we need to celebrate the notion of a rainbow nation more instead of fighting for personal or political gain. The colonization of South Africa. The colonization of South Africa is mostly attributed to the Europeans. A closer investigation, however, shows that there is more to it than meets the eye. This is the reason why the colonization process can actually be divided into 3 categories, namely an unofficial colonization, 2 official colonizations, and lastly, an internal colonization. Unofficial colonization. About 2,000 years ago, some farmer and metal worker group left North Africa to move southwards through Cameroon and Eastern Africa. In these parts of the continent, and especially in Cameroon, farming was originally developed. Some of these groups that moved south eventually settled in the northern to northeastern parts of today's South Africa about 1700 years ago, or between 400 and 800 CE. In Pungubwe, adjacent to the Limpopo River, the northern boundaries of South Africa, evidence can be found of a kingdom that existed there at approximately 1000 to 1300 CE. That people group, probably with Venda origins, produced golden artifacts. The groups that settled more southwards between 1500 and 1800 CE were the ancestors of the Bantu-speaking people groups in South Africa called the Southeastern Bantu. They settled in the northern, eastern, and central parts of South Africa, forming clans with their own identities and hierarchical social-political rank structures. These groups or clans consisted of Nguni and the Sotho or Tswana clans, living also in Botswana, the Tsonga clans in Mozambique and northeastern South Africa, the Shona clans in Zimbabwe, and their close relatives, the Venda, who arrived in the northern parts of South Africa during the 18th century, as well as the Lemba, living in small groups with other clans like the Venda and the Sotho in the northern parts of South Africa. The Sotho or Tswana clans originating from Tanzania first occupied and dominated the northern parts of South Africa, and by 1500 they expanded more southwards and eastwards in the country. The Nguni clans originating from the Great Lakes region in Eastern Africa and migrating southwards between 900 and 1290 belonged to one language group but divided into smaller groups, each with its own culture, character, and dialects. During the 14th century, they moved inland from the present KwaZulu-Natal. During the 19th century, they could already be found in the vicinity of Swaziland, northeast and east of Pretoria, in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. During the 17th century, the northern Nguni groups could be divided into 3 groups called the Lala, the Mbo and the Ntungwa. By 1800, they split up into smaller groups and settled east of Swaziland. The southern Nguni groups already occupied the territory between the eastern Cape of KwaZulu-Natal in the vicinity of Umzimvubu River. The most prominent groups were the Mpondo, Mponomise, Tembu, and the Xhosa groups. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the Ndebele clans occupied the northern parts of South Africa, now called Gauteng, Mpumalanga, and Limpopo. During the 19th century, the Matabele, and sometimes mixed up with the Ndebele, left KwaZulu-Natal for the northern parts of South Africa and later on for the western parts of Zimbabwe. The Sotho clans occupied the interior of South Africa and Botswana. Evidence of occupying these parts of the country is signaling a time frame between 700 and 1300 CE. The Venda clans already occupied the northern parts of Limpopo during the first half of the 18th century. According to Giliomee Mbenga, the migrations inside South Africa can be defined by two terms. Segmentation refers to groups who divided into two or more groups, while differentiation refers to a process whereby certain individuals came to secure political, social, and economic power over others. The Khoisan people, together with some black people groups, sometimes called Negroid, were the earliest inhabitants of Highveld to the middle and north of South Africa. Black people groups then invaded that part of the country from the north. The Phokeng people, originally with the Nguni culture, was the product of the interaction between the invaders and the local people. The Sotho or Tswana chiefdoms eventually resulted from these interactions. From here, certain parts of these groups moved southwards and ended up in the Northern Cape. After 1750, kinship wars started to break out between the chiefdoms, while other black people groups intervened in these wars and established a stronghold. The earliest Nguni groups lived along the eastern coast of South Africa in KwaZulu-Natal. They eventually became separate kingdoms of the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Swazi, Mpondo, and Tembu of today. From 1818 to 1828, King Shaka ruled and established his Zulu kingdom in the northern part of the KwaZulu-Natal between the Tugela and Pongola River, incorporating all the other chiefdoms in that area. Vasco quite rightly argued that these invasions and migrations can also be called colonization. We refer to it as unofficial colonization. Much of what has been said under the previous subheading, tools and weapons that have been discovered in the country and linked to specific eras in history. It is not derived from noted evidence, as the mentioned people groups were part of an oral culture where almost nothing was noted on paper, but was orally related from generation to generation. That is the reason why the migration are referred to as an unofficial colonization. We can also call it the first colonization of this country. The European who landed in the Cape and who invaded it from the south formed part of the generations in which documentations played an important role. This could be one of the reasons why the invasion of Africa from the south was referred to as colonization, implying that the invaders or migrators, not migrants, were part of the country's original populace, the indigenous people. A few remarks need consideration. The original inhabitants, indigenous people, of the southern parts of Africa did not claim this part of the continent to be their official or legal property, as a great contingent of them was nomads. They were in fact just roaming the territory. There were, however, certain groups occupying specific areas, specifically close to the water, like the pastoral Khoikhoi tribes, but without a formal political structure or demarcation of land. Certain black people groups migrating to this part of Africa did, however, claim certain parts of the land to be theirs and therefore establish kingdoms for themselves, as has already been referred to. The kingdoms had the implication of claiming a certain area as the sole property of the chief and his adherents or clan. Should another group cross the borders of that demarcated land, then confrontation would take place, mostly in the form of a battle. As the number of black people in the southern parts of Africa increased rapidly, these groups expanded more to the south of the country. As they expanded, they regarded more parts of the land and belonging to themselves. The Europeans in the south expanded to, or invaded, their immediate north and especially to the east of the country. This brought them to the western side of the Fish River, where they met or clashed with a black people group called the Xhosa, who arrived on the other side of the river. This happened in 1770. From 1834, the Afrikaner group, also called Frederik at that time, invaded the country firstly to the eastern parts, presently KwaZulu-Natal, and then to the northern parts as far as the Limpopo River, being almost in constant battle with the black migrants, conquering the migrants' claimed territory. The southernmost part of Africa, therefore, was initially officially invaded by colonizers, while the rest of the present South Africa was initially and unofficially invaded by black people groups, before the white people later took it from them in battle. After 1852, most of South Africa up to the Limpopo River was conquered by white people. 1880 saw 4 white polities in South Africa, namely the Cape Colony and Natal under British reign, and the Orange Free State, Orange Free State, and the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic, South African Republic, under Afrikaner reign. The black people groups living in all 4 of these areas were dominated by the white people, as a policy of severely unequal segregation was imposed on them. The majority of the original indigenous people of the land, the Khoikhoi, was forced out of most of the country of the southern and southwestern parts to make a living there. Some of them were incorporated by especially Xhosa chiefdoms, and their children became Xhosa. South Africa thus experienced an official invasion by the Europeans and an unofficial invasion by the migrants, both of them devastating to the indigenous people of the country as well as to each other. Adhikari portrayed 2 phases of destruction, one by the earliest farmers and the second by the Europeans. Phase 1. Historically, the destruction of Cape San society can be viewed as part of the series of overlapping, essentially concentric, global movements of violent subjugation that were often genocidal in nature. The broadcast of these is the 12,000 years history of the absorption, displacement and destruction of hunter-gatherer communities by farmers. Phase 2. San bushman society in the Cape Colony was almost completely annihilated during the 18th and 19th centuries as a result of land confiscation, massacre, forced labor, and cultural suppression that accompanied colonial rule. Stay tuned for the next continuation of video. And that's it from Injibs Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.